The sub-zero air shredded David Morgan's throat as he gasped for oxygen, frantically dragging his mangled body from the smoldering wreckage of his spacecraft. Ramara's icy surface bit into his flesh like 1,000 frozen knives. David's blood sprayed across the snow, flash freezing into crimson shards. The temperature plummeted to a lethal 150 degrees C as Ramara's 3 suns vanished beneath the horizon one by one, abandoning the alien landscape to merciless darkness and even colder temperatures. David's fingers were numb, nearly useless, as he fumbled with his emergency beacon. The device flickered to life, but the power cell's charge bled away in seconds, drained by the murderous cold. Barely conscious, shaking uncontrollably, the human explorer crawled to his insulated survival shelter. He had just enough strength left to seal himself inside the cramped refuge before blacking out as the temperature continued to drop precipitously. High above the frigid surface, in an orbiting Riemann science station, Commander Mira nearly fell out of her chair when long-range scanners picked up the faint signal of David's beacon. There couldn't be a living thing down there. Just a few minutes' exposure would snap-freeze her aquatic species' gelatinous flesh into shattered ice crystals. Remara's infamous pole-to-pole winter storm was mere hours away. For 4 solid months, the entire planet would be scoured by 500 Mach winds and bludgeoned by 300 °C temperatures. Anything left on the surface would be annihilated, reduced to frozen splinters. Racing the clock, Mira mustered a heavily armed and insulated rescue craft. As it knifed through the stratosphere, she expected to find nothing but pulverized fragments. Instead, her crew gaped in shock as the unknown life form's heat signature glowed defiantly within a crude emergency shelter. Instrument readings indicated the life form was not only alive, but stable, despite the shelter's flimsy exterior. No Riemann could have withstood even a fraction of such exposure. What species could possibly be hardy enough to survive this hellscape? Mira had to know. She ordered her team to deploy, to retrieve the entity before the roaring wall of ice and death swallowed it forever. But when they breached the shelter and discovered the mysterious survivor was a mere human, a race technologically centuries behind her own, Mira realized everything her people believed about the limitations of life was utterly wrong. The rescue team pushed relentlessly through the maelstrom toward David Morgan's emergency shelter, as razor-sharp ice shards lacerated their protective suits. The Riemann's armor, designed to withstand the most extreme environments they had ever faced, began to splinter and freeze over. Alarms screeched inside their helmets as the suit's integrity dropped below half-strength. Commander Mira barked the order to fall back to the ship, her usually calm voice edged with urgency. Inside the rescue craft, Mira's fingers flew across the environmental controls, desperately trying to keep the ship's systems from succumbing to Ramara's lethal cold. She cranked the heat to maximum output, but it wasn't enough. The temperature inside the cabin plunged steadily downward. Ice crystals spread across the walls and control panels like a cancer. Mira's team clustered together, their gelatinous flesh quivering violently as they tried to conserve warmth. A bitter realization settled over Mira. Even their cutting-edge spacecraft, a marvel of Riemann engineering, was defenseless against this alien world's ferocious climate. Mira's heart constricted as she faced an awful truth. They had to retreat to the outpost before the ship's systems went offline completely. But leaving the human behind, to face certain death, was unacceptable. She couldn't abandon him to that fate. Mira checked her suit's readouts. The armor's heat and oxygen reserves were dwindling fast, but there was no choice. She had to try. Sealing her helmet, Mira ventured out alone into the shrieking winds and blinding snow. Her suit's alarms wailed, the high-pitched warnings boring into her skull. The cold pierced through the cracked armor, flooding her body with a bone-deep numbness that dragged at her consciousness. Each step was a battle as she slogged toward the human's shelter. Mira's limbs felt clumsy and useless, as if carved from ice themselves. Her thoughts turned sluggish, her vision narrowing to a hazy tunnel. At the moment she was certain she could go no further. The shelter's dim shape materialized just ahead. With the last of her failing strength, Mira stumbled through the airlock, slamming the controls closed behind her. The human lay insensate, but breathing on the floor of the tiny refuge. Impossibly, inexplicably, his body pulsed with warmth, as if the murderous cold was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Mira's shock quickly gave way to a renewed surge of purpose. She grabbed the human under his arms and dragged him back across the ice-scoured hellscape, not daring to contemplate the repercussions of her actions. Her team hauled them both into the ship, sealing the cargo bay and rocketing back toward the orbiting outpost. As they rose through the stratosphere, leaving the roaring maelstrom behind, Mira collapsed beside the human's unconscious form, her mind awhirl with impossible questions. How could this human, this fragile alien, have endured Ramara's brutal landscape? How had he survived exposure that would have flayed the flesh from her team's bones in minutes? What other capabilities were his species hiding? And the most pressing question of all, why had he come to Ramara's deadly surface? What could possibly be worth that risk? Mira watched as the human began to groan and shift, the first signs of returning consciousness. She mentally braced herself, knowing the interrogation that was to come might unearth unimaginable secrets, revelations that could change everything her people thought they understood about the nature of life itself. The human's eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear written in their depths. Mira leaned forward, her voice deceptively soft, masking the steel of her purpose. "Who are you?" she demanded. "And why have you come here?" The human's gaze flickered toward the viewport, where the rapidly receding curve of Ramara loomed below them, still lost in the grip of its relentless winter storm. When he spoke, his voice was a ragged whisper, raw and choked from screaming against the cold, but his words sent a chill down Mira's spine that had nothing to do with the fading numbness in her limbs. David's words hung in the air, their chilling implications settling over Mira and her team like a suffocating shroud. The Raymond commander stared at the human, her mind racing to process the shocking revelations he had just unleashed. The medical bay suddenly felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in around them, as the weight of David's disclosures pressed down on their shoulders. Mira's team shifted uneasily, their gazes flickering between the restrained human and the flashing monitors that now seemed to pulse with an ominous urgency. Mira forced herself to focus, pushing aside the rising tide of dread that threatened to overwhelm her. She leaned in closer to David, her voice low and measured. "What do you mean we're too late? What have you done?" He shifted on the metal table, his restraints creaking as he tested their strength. "You see, I'm not just some random survivor. I'm part of something bigger, something that's been in the works for decades, the experiments, the enhancements. It's all been leading up to this moment." Mira's mind reeled as she tried to process the implications of David's words. The idea of a secret human organization dedicated to pushing the boundaries of biological manipulation and enhancement was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. She glanced at her team, seeing her own shock and disbelief mirrored in their expressions. The Raymonds had always prided themselves on their technological superiority, but now they were confronted with the possibility that the humans had been harboring secrets far beyond their wildest imaginings. Suddenly the outpost's alarms intensified, their shrill wailing slicing through the tense atmosphere of the medical bay. Mira whirled around, her attention snapping to the console, where a series of flashing warnings demanded her immediate focus. As she scanned the incoming data, her eyes widened in horror. The sensors were detecting a massive energy surge emanating from Ramara's surface, followed by a rapidly expanding heat signature that defied all logical explanation. Mira's gaze snapped back to David, who was now watching her with a cold, knowing smile. "You thought I was alone?" he asked, his voice dripping with malevolent satisfaction. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Raymond. You should have left me on that planet. Now it's too late. For all of us. For all." As the heat signature on Ramara's surface continued to grow, spreading like a malignant cancer across the icy landscape, Mira felt a cold, sinking dread settle in the pit of her stomach. She realized with a sickening clarity that they had unwittingly unleashed something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. And now, whatever it was coming for them. Mira raced through the outpost's winding corridors, her team close at her heels. The station's alarms wailed, a deafening cacophony that reverberated off the metal walls. In the command center, a holographic display of Ramara hung in the air, the ominous heat signature pulsing like a festering wound on the planet's surface. "Divert all available power to the shields," Mira barked, her fingers flying across the control panel. "And someone get me a status report on those objects launching from the surface." A technician hunched over a sensor array, his gelatinous face contorted in concentration. "Commander, the objects appear to be spacecraft, heavily armed and moving at impossible velocities." Mira's stomach clenched. Whatever they were facing, it was beyond anything the Remans had ever encountered. She turned to the security detail. "Seal off all non-essential sections of the outpost. We need to buy ourselves time to figure out what we're dealing with." As the crew scrambled to fortify the outpost's defenses, Mira returned to the medical bay where David lay restrained. She leaned over him, her eyes narrowing. "What have you unleashed?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. David's lips curled into a cryptic smile, his eyes gleaming with the unsettling mix of pride and madness. "You have no idea what's coming, Raymond. No idea at all." Before Mira could press further, the outpost shuddered violently, throwing her off balance. On the view screen, a swarm of sleek, predatory ships descended upon the station, their weapons slicing through the shields as if they were gossamer. The Remans returned fire, launching a barrage of their most advanced weaponry. But the attacking ships danced and wove through the onslaught, their movements too swift, too precise to track. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks as the outpost's defenses crumbled under the relentless assault. In the medical bay, David began to convulse, his body thrashing against the restraints. Mira watched in horror as his skin rippled and deformed, muscles and sinew twisting into grotesque new configurations beneath the surface. With a sickening crack, the restraints shattered, and David sat up, his body now a coiled mass of inhuman power. He turned to face Mira, his once human features warped into a monstrous visage. "How you wanted to know our secret?" he snarled, his voice a guttural rasp. "We adapt, we evolve, we become more than human." In a blur of motion, David lunged at Mira, his distorted limbs propelling him forward with terrifying speed. Mira stumbled back, barely evading his grasp as her security team opened fire. But the energy bolts ricocheted harmlessly off David's transformed flesh, leaving smoking craters that healed over in seconds. With a roar, he tore into the Remans, ripping through their armor as if it were paper. Mira could only watch in numb horror as David carved a path of destruction through the outpost, his monstrous form shrugging off everything the Remans threw at him. The station bucked and heaved as the attacking ships continued their merciless bombardment, the scream of rending metal mingling with the cries of the dying. As the outpost crumbled around her, and the abomination that had once been David rampaged unchecked, Mira realized the true scope of the nightmare they had unwittingly unleashed. This was an enemy that didn't just survive in the harshest conditions. It thrived in them, adapted to them, wielded them like a weapon. And as the battle raged on, the horrifying realization dawned on Mira that this was only the beginning, a prelude to a war that would push her species to the brink and beyond, forcing them to confront the very nature of life, death, and evolution itself. Mira's heart pounded as the central control room's reinforced doors shuddered under the relentless pounding of David's grotesque form. The handful of survivors crouched behind overturned consoles, clutching salvaged weapons with shaking hands. Mira's fingers flew across the comms panel, scrambling to punch through the interference and reach the Reman fleet. Static crackled and popped, the signal wavering, just as a flicker of hope bloomed in her chest at the sight of a blurry connection. The monitors flashed to life with a nightmarish visage. David's face, twisted beyond recognition, filled the screens. Ridges of exposed bone jutted from pulsing, discolored flesh. Razor-tipped tentacles lashed the air behind him, dripping ichor. His eyes blazed with a feverish, fanatical light. "I think you can stop us, Raymond," he sneered, his voice a guttural rasp that sent icy tendrils slithering down Mira's spine. We are the future. We are the next step in human evolution, and we will not be denied our destiny. The screens flickered and changed, a dizzying montage of horror unfolding before Mira's disbelieving eyes. She saw other creatures like David, nightmarish parodies of the human form, rampaging through the shattered ruins of a dozen alien cities. They strode unharmed through the inferno of molten worlds, shrugged off the crushing depths of gas-giant oceans, and stalked the airless void of space like vengeful gods. And in their wake, they left only death and destruction, civilizations crumbling to ash beneath their relentless advance. Cold realization crept through Mira's veins, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The attack on the outpost was merely the opening salvo in a war that had been planned for decades, perhaps even centuries. David's resistance to Ramara's brutal cold was just a hint of the true extent of the humans' capabilities, a single card played from a deck stacked with aces. The doors shuddered again, the metal buckling inward. Mira dragged her gaze back to the comms panel, her voice shaking as she forced out a desperate plea to the stars. "This is Commander Mira of the Remeran outpost, requesting immediate assistance. We are under attack by an unknown enemy. Repeat, we are under—" The doors exploded inward, a twisted mass of metal and composites that crushed two of the survivors beneath its weight. David surged into the room, his grotesque form filling the doorway. His tentacles lashed out, impaling another Raymond and flinging the twitching corpse aside like a rag doll. Mira snatched up a plasma rifle and opened fire, the searing bolt splashing harmlessly against David's hide. His laughter filled the room, a sound that scraped like broken glass across her sanity. As the monstrosity that had once been human closed in, Mira raised her weapon in a final defiant stand. She knew in her heart that it was too late, that the Raymond fleet could never arrive in time to stem the tide of this unimaginable invasion. But she would fight to her last breath, a final beacon of resistance against an enemy that defied every law of nature, every shred of decency and morality. In the face of annihilation, Mira stood tall, the muzzle of her rifle trained on the abomination before her. She whispered a prayer to the stars, to the countless civilizations that would soon face the same horror, the same unstoppable onslaught. And as David's tentacles coiled around her, as his jaws gaped wide to reveal rows of serrated teeth, Mira squeezed the trigger and unleashed a final, futile burst of plasma into the face of the nightmare made flesh. A deafening explosion rocked the control room, hurling Mira and her crew to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Consoles erupted in showers of sparks, the acrid stench of burning plastic and metal filling the air. Through the viewport, the flashes of a fierce space battle lit up the void. The Riemann fleet had arrived, launching a desperate assault on the outpost to contain the human threat. David staggered back, his grotesque form struggling to maintain balance. Mira seized the momentary advantage, snatching up a plasma rifle and firing point-blank at David's chest. The searing bolt slammed into him, forcing him back with a roar of pain and rage. But the respite was fleeting. Even as the plasma scorched his flesh, David's body began to regenerate, the wound knitting itself closed with sickening speed. He lunged at Mira once more, his distorted features contorted in a mask of primal fury. Mira dodged his grasp by a hair's breadth, the heat of his passing searing her skin. She spun away, shouting for her crew to make for the emergency escape pods. They sprinted through the buckling corridors, the deck plates shuddering beneath their feet, as the outpost's hull integrity weakened under the relentless bombardment. They hurled themselves into the nearest pod, sealing the hatch just as David's monstrous form came crashing through the bulkhead behind them. Mira slammed her fist against the launch controls, and the pod blasted free of the disintegrating outpost. As they hurtled away from the besieged station, Mira and her crew could only watch in numb horror as the Raymond fleet engaged the human ships in a titanic space battle. The Raymond vessels, sleek and deadly, unleashed a storm of fire upon the enemy, their advanced weapons carving molten paths through the void. But the humans were too many, too fast, too adaptable. They swarmed the Riemann ships like enraged hornets, their own weapons spitting back in a relentless onslaught. One by one, the Riemann ships succumbed to the overwhelming assault, their hulls shattering, spilling gouts of flame and debris into the pitiless vacuum. Mira's escape pod, damaged in the firefight, shuddered and veered off course, caught in the gravitational pull of a nearby gas giant. The pod plummeted towards the planet's swirling toxic atmosphere, alarms shrieking as the hull temperature spiked dangerously. Inside the cramped confines of the pod, Mira and her crew worked frantically to repair the damaged systems, their fingers flying over sparking consoles and exposed wiring. They had minutes, perhaps less, before the immense pressure and searing heat of the gas giant's atmosphere crushed the pod like an eggshell. Sweat poured down Mira's face, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought to reroute power to the failing engines. Just as the pod began to shake apart, the hull glowing cherry red with the heat of re-entry, Mira managed to reboot the propulsion system and wrench them away from certain death. But as they emerged from the upper atmosphere, their relief was short-lived. A sight greeted them that chilled their blood and turned their triumph to ashes in their mouths. Hovering in orbit around the planet, eclipsing the stars, was a human ship of staggering proportions, dwarfing even the mightiest Riemann dreadnoughts. And pouring from its cavernous hangars was a swarm of smaller craft, each one bearing the unmistakable silhouette of the evolved human warriors. Mira's heart sank as the terrible realization crashed over her. The attack on the outpost had been a ruse, a diversion, a ploy to draw the Riemann fleet away from their homeworld, leaving it vulnerable to the true scope of the human invasion. And now, as the human ships descended upon the planet like a plague of locusts, blotting out the stars, Mira knew that the very fate of her species hung in the balance. If they were to have any hope of survival, any chance of turning back the tide of this nightmare, they would need to find a way to unlock the secrets of the humans' terrifying evolution. Mira gripped the controls of the escape pod, her knuckles bleached bone white as she wrenched the vessel through a dizzying array of evasive maneuvers. The human ships swarmed around them like predators, their weapons carving molten scars across the pod's battered hull. Riemann blood pooled on the deck, seeping from the wounds of Mira's injured crewmates. The pod shuddered and shrieked, its engines straining to maintain their tenuous grip on life. Mira's heart hammered in her chest as she fought to keep the pod on course, knowing that even the slightest miscalculation could send them spiraling into oblivion. As they broke through the atmosphere, the true horror of the situation unfolded before them. The once gleaming spires of the Riemann capital lay in ruins, their twisted remains jutting like broken teeth from the scarred landscape. Smoke and flames billowed from the wreckage of shattered buildings, and the streets ran slick with the blood of the fallen. The pod shook violently as it descended, buffeted by the shock waves of nearby explosions. Mira guided it towards the outskirts of the city, where she knew the entrance to the secret bunker complex lay hidden. She had to reach the Riemann leadership to warn them of the true nature of the threat they faced. With a bone-jarring impact, the pod slammed into the ground, skidding and bouncing across the rubble-strewn surface. Mira and her crew were thrown about like ragdolls, their bodies battered and bruised by the force of the crash. As the dust settled, Mira dragged herself from the wreckage, her legs trembling beneath her. She half-carried, half-dragged her wounded crewmates towards the bunker entrance, a hidden door set into the base of a shattered monument. Inside, the bunker was a scene of controlled chaos. Riemann soldiers and scientists rushed back and forth, their faces etched with fear and desperation. Mira stumbled through the crowded corridors, searching for someone, anyone, who could help her make sense of the nightmare they were facing. She found the Riemann leaders gathered in a dimly lit conference room, their faces drawn and haggard, as they pored over holographic displays of the battle raging above. Mira pushed her way into the room, her voice raw with urgency, as she told them of her encounter with David, of the horrifying truth she had learned about the humans' abilities. As she spoke, a group of scientists entered the room, their expressions grim. They had been analyzing the data from the outpost attack, searching for any clue that might help them turn the tide of the war. "Commander Mira," one of the scientists said, his voice trembling, We've made a discovery. The humans' abilities, they're not natural. They're the result of nanomachines, tiny robots that have been integrated into their bodies. Mira felt a chill run down her spine as the scientist continued. These nanomachines allow the humans to adapt to any environment, to evolve and improve with each new challenge they face. They're not just soldiers, Commander. They're the ultimate survivors. The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation sank in. Mira realized with a sinking feeling that they were not just fighting an enemy army, but an enemy that could adapt and evolve faster than they could ever hope to match. She knew that their only hope was to find a way to neutralize the nanomachines, to strip the humans of their terrifying abilities. But as another bombardment rocked the bunker, sending dust and debris raining down from the ceiling, Mira realized that time was running out. The Remans were on the brink of total defeat, their civilization teetering on the edge of extinction. And somewhere out there, David and his army of evolved warriors were closing in, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. Mira turned to face the Reman leaders, her expression hardening with resolve. She knew that the fate of her entire species hung in the balance, and that the decisions they made in the next few hours would determine whether the Remans survived to see another dawn. Mira's fingers tightened around her plasma rifle as she crept through the rubble-strewn streets, her small team of Reman soldiers fanning out behind her. The acrid stench of burning metal and plastic hung heavy in the air, mingling with the coppery tang of spilled blood. Twisted wreckage and shattered buildings stretched as far as the eye could see, a grim testament to the destructive power of the human invasion. Mira's heart hammered in her chest as they approached the crash site of the human ship, its once sleek hull now a mangled ruin of jagged metal and sparking wires. She signaled for her team to take up defensive positions, their weapons trained on the shadows that seemed to writhe and shift with malevolent intent. Suddenly, a hail of plasma bolts sliced through the air, scattering the Remans like leaves in a storm. Mira dove for cover behind a shattered wall, her rifle coming up to return fire, but even as she squeezed the trigger, she knew it was hopeless. The evolved humans were everywhere, their grotesque forms darting and weaving through the rubble with unnatural speed and agility. Mira's team fell one by one, their screams of agony cut short by the sickening crunch of bone and the wet squelch of tearing flesh. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Mira saw him. David, the monster who had once been human, striding through the carnage like a god of war. His twisted features were contorted in a snarl of rage and triumph, his clawed hands dripping with Reman blood. Mira felt a surge of terror and revulsion as David's gaze locked onto hers, his eyes blazing with a feral intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense of humanity. He lunged at her, his movements a blur of speed and power, and Mira barely managed to dodge aside as his claws whistled past her throat. She brought her rifle up, aiming point-blank at David's chest, and squeezed the trigger. The plasma bolt slammed into his flesh with a sizzling hiss, and for a moment Mira dared to hope that it might be enough. But even as she watched, the wound began to knit itself back together, the jagged edges of torn flesh and shattered bone flowing like molten wax as the nanomachines in David's body worked their horrifying magic. In seconds, the wound had vanished, leaving only a faint silvery scar in its wake. David grinned, a predatory smile that sent icy tendrils of fear slithering down Mira's spine. "You still don't get it, do you?" he growled, his voice a guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. "We are the future. We are the next step in evolution. And you? You're just another obstacle to be overcome." Mira's mind raced as she stared into the face of the monster, her every instinct screaming at her to run, to flee, to put as much distance between herself and this abomination as possible. But even as the fear threatened to overwhelm her, a flicker of memory surfaced in her mind, a fragment of data she had seen in the Reman bunker, a mention of a computer virus that had been developed as a potential weapon against the humans' nanomachines. It was a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to find a chink in the seemingly invincible armor of the evolved humans, but it was the only chance they had. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled speed, Mira broke away from David, sprinting towards the downed ship with every ounce of strength she possessed. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps pounding like thunder as he gave chase, but she didn't dare look back. Her heart hammered in her chest as she raced up the ship's shattered ramp, her feet pounding against the twisted metal. She could feel David's breath on the back of her neck, could sense his clawed hands reaching out to seize her, to drag her back into the nightmare from which there could be no escape. But even as the terror threatened to overwhelm her, Mira's fingers closed around the hilt of her plasma knife, the weapon's familiar weight a comforting presence in her hand. She spun to face her pursuer, the blade flashing in the dim light of the ship's interior. David lunged at her, his claws slashing through the air with blinding speed. But Mira was ready for him. She ducked beneath his blow and plunged the knife into his chest, the plasma-heated blade sinking deep into his flesh. David howled in agony, his body convulsing as the nanomachines in his bloodstream fought to repair the damage. But even as they worked their dark magic, Mira was already moving, racing deeper into the ship's labyrinthine corridors. She had to find the computer core, had to upload the virus before it was too late. The fate of her entire species hung in the balance, and she was the only one who could. Make her way through the labyrinthine corridors of the downed human ship. The air is thick, with the acrid stench of burnt circuitry and spilled coolant, the deck plates slick with viscous fluids. Sparks rain down from ruptured conduits, casting eerie shadows across the twisted wreckage. Mira's heart pounds in her chest as she navigates the treacherous path, the sound of distant explosions and the ominous groans of buckling metal spurring her forward. She knows that David and his monstrous warriors are close behind, their inhuman senses tracking her every move. She rounds a corner and finds herself face to face with the ship's central computer core, a pulsing mass of glowing circuitry and humming databanks. Mira's fingers tremble as she interfaces with the alien technology, her mind racing as she tries to find the access point for the virus that could be the Raymond's last hope. The computer's holographic displays flicker and dance, the alien script scrolling past in a dizzying blur. Mira's eyes strain to make sense of the data, her breath catching in her throat as she searches for the key to uploading the virus. Suddenly, a terrifying roar echoes through the ship, the sound of rending metal and shattering glass drawing ever closer. David has found her, his monstrous form tearing through the wreckage with terrifying speed and strength. Mira's fingers fly across the interface, her desperation mounting as she tries to finish the upload before it's too late. She can hear David's heavy footsteps pounding down the corridor, the sound of his enraged growls sending icy tendrils of fear down her spine. Just as David bursts into the room, his twisted visage contorted with rage, Mira slams her hand down on the final command. The virus surges through the ship's systems, spreading like wildfire through the network of nanomachines that give the evolved humans their terrifying abilities. David lets out a howl of agony and staggers back, his body convulsing as the virus attacks the very essence of his being. Mira watches in horrified fascination as his monstrous adaptations begin to wither and die, the unnatural strength and resilience that had made him such a formidable foe crumbling away before her eyes. But even as David weakens, Mira knows that the battle is far from over. The human fleet still darkens the skies above her homeworld, their ships raining down destruction on the beleaguered Raymond defenders. And somewhere out there, countless other evolved warriors like David are still waiting, ready to continue the fight. Mira staggers out of the wreckage of the downed ship, her head spinning with exhaustion and the magnitude of what she has just accomplished. The acrid stench of smoke and death hangs heavy in the air, the distant sounds of battle still echoing across the ravaged landscape. She looks up at the sky, where the human ships are still locked in a deadly dance with the remnants of the Raymond fleet. The odds are stacked against her people, the enemy's numbers and technological superiority seemingly insurmountable. But for the first time since the invasion began, Mira feels a flicker of hope. The virus has given the Raymonds a chance, a way to level the playing field against an enemy that had once seemed invincible, and she knows that her people will fight on, will use every weapon and stratagem at their disposal to drive the human menace from their skies and their worlds. As Mira sets out to rejoin her comrades, her steps are heavy with the weight of the challenges that lie ahead, but she carries with her a newfound understanding of the true nature of the enemy they face, and a grim determination to do whatever it takes to ensure the survival of her species. The battle for the Riemann homeworld has only just begun, and Mira knows that the road ahead will be long and bloody. But with the virus as their ally, and the indomitable will of her people as their strength, she believes that victory is still within reach. Mira stumbled through the ruins of the Riemann stronghold, her lungs burning with each smoke-filled breath. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid tang of burnt metal and scorched flesh. Her eyes watered as she picked her way through the rubble. The shattered remains of once mighty walls and towers, now reduced to jagged piles of stone and twisted steel. Everywhere she looked, Mira saw the lifeless bodies of Riemann soldiers, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and terror. Many had been crushed beneath the falling debris, their limbs twisted at impossible angles, their armor crumpled like tin foil. Others had been incinerated by the humans' relentless bombardment, their charred corpses barely recognizable as having once been living beings. Mira's heart clenched with each step, the weight of her people's losses pressing down on her like a physical burden. She had known many of these soldiers, had fought alongside them, had shared in their triumphs and their sorrows. And now they were gone, their lives snuffed out in a brutal instant, their sacrifices rendered meaningless by the overwhelming might of the human forces. As she neared the center of the stronghold, Mira caught sight of a makeshift command post, hastily erected amidst the ruins. She limped towards it, her injured leg sending jolts of pain shooting up her spine with each step. Inside, she found a handful of Riemann leaders huddled around a flickering holographic display, their faces gaunt and haggard, their eyes haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. They looked up as Mira entered, their expressions a mix of fear, desperation, and a faint glimmer of hope. "Commander Mira," one of them rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion and grief. "What news from the front?" Mira took a deep breath, steeling herself for the reaction she knew was coming. "I managed to infiltrate one of the human ships," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I uploaded a virus to their systems, one that should disrupt their nanomachines and give us a fighting chance." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Mira's words sinking in. Then, one by one, the Riemann leaders began to murmur, their voices rising in a chorus of disbelief and elation. "Can it be true?" one of them asked, his eyes wide with hope. "Could this be the turning point we've been praying for?" But before Mira could respond, a sudden tremor rocked the ground beneath their feet, sending them stumbling and grabbing for support. The walls of the command post shuddered and groaned, cracks spiderwebbing across their surface as the earth heaved and buckled. "They're bombarding us again," someone shouted, their voice high and thin with panic. "We have to evacuate now." Mira and the others raced for the exit, dodging falling debris and leaping over piles of rubble. But even as they ran, they could hear the ominous creaking and groaning of the structure around them, the walls and ceiling bowing inward under the relentless assault. They had almost reached the doorway, when the roof above them gave way with a deafening roar. A massive slab of concrete and metal crashing down on top of them. Mira threw herself forward, rolling clear of the worst of the debris, but many of the others were not so lucky. She heard their screams, saw their bodies crushed and mangled beneath the wreckage, and felt a wave of despair wash over her. As the dust began to settle, Mira dragged herself to her feet, her body battered and bleeding, her mind reeling from the horror of what she had just witnessed. She staggered out into the open air, her lungs searing with each breath, her eyes stinging from the smoke and ash that choked the sky. And as she looked out over the shattered remains of her homeworld, Mira felt a bitter realization settle in her gut. The Riemanns had struck a blow against the humans, yes, but at what cost? Their cities lay in ruins, their people scattered and broken, their once proud civilization reduced to ashes and dust. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.